Thank you for joining us for our session, for the keynote session for this year's Nurturing Developing Minds Conference. We're looking forward to a great session. A few logistics notes as we begin. The session is being recorded and the chat is being archived. Attendees are in view only mode to keep things orderly, and you cannot use your microphone. We encourage you though to use your chat box throughout the session to engage with the group. You can post here for any technical issues that you experience, as well as any questions you would like to share with presenters. We will share these questions toward the end of the session. This session uses auto captioning. While these captions will not be exact, we hope they can improve accessibility for all attendees. To activate these as a viewer, please look for an option on your toolbar that says Live Transcript, should be right beside the More button, and select either subtitles or full transcript, which will appear in a sidebar. Your options may differ a little bit on a mobile device. And also we're offering ASL interpretation for the session. Please ensure that you are using gallery view if you want to see the ASL interpretation and not speaker view on your screen to ensure that you'll see the active interpreter alongside the speaker of the session. If you're intending to claim professional development credit through SC Endeavors for early educators for attending the session, please complete the submission form we're about to share in the chat box before the end of the session. This is essential to having the information needed to process your credits. Remember that you must attend the session for the full 1 hour full 1 hour duration to receive this credit. And with that, I'm gonna pass the floor to Dr. Desmond Kelly. Dr. Kelly.
Thank you, Brian, and good morning and welcome to you all. I'm Desmond Kelly with the Health Sciences Center and the Children's Hospital at Prisma Health and the University of South Carolina School of Medicine in Greenville. And I'm Outreach Director for South Carolina LEND, and that stands for Leadership Education in Neurodevelopmental Disabilities Program, the co-sponsor of this conference. I've also been involved with the Institute for Child Success since its inception, and I'm glad to be joined for this introduction by Jamie Moon, who's the Executive Director of ICS. So on behalf of ICS and the SCLN program and its directors, Dr. Michelle Macias, Dr. David Rothhaus, and Dr. Ann Kinsman, it is my honor to officially welcome you to this conference. We are very happy to have you join us and thrilled at the high number of registrants, well over 400, for this virtual conference. We've been presenting Nurturing Developing Minds annually for over 16 years now, and we cherish the opportunity to join together across the large range of disciplines represented by all of you professionals who are dedicated to supporting the optimal, healthy development of children. The networking and camaraderie of our in-person conferences has been extremely energizing through the years, but of course that's not possible for us to be together in person this year. However, it appears that the virtual nature of the event has made it accessible to many more of you, and I welcome those of you who are joining us for the first time this year, especially you folk in early intervention and early childhood education. It's just great to have you here. So let's give each other a virtual and socially distanced high five or a hug, and look forward to a productive and instructive next 4 hours. The program, as you, I think, know already, is jam-packed with information to help us nurture those developing minds, especially during this trying time that we are now experiencing. Before handing over to Jamie, I do want to thank the planning committee for this conference, and especially the folk who've done all the work. So you've already heard Brian Burrows, Megan Carolyn is behind the scenes, and the team at ICS have done so much work to make this happen. And at South Carolina LEND, Nina Khan and her team, and at Prisma Health, and all of the folk that have been involved in making this possible. And to the Institute for Child Success Research Committee, led by Dee Steglin, who've helped in putting together this program. So I'm going to hand over to Jamie.
Thank you. So thank you, Dr. Kelly. So good morning, everyone. My name is Jamie Moon, and I am the president of the Institute for Child Success, and I join with Dr. Kelly in welcoming you all to today's Nurturing Developing Minds session. We are absolutely delighted that you've chosen to be with us today. I think you will agree that this year's planning committee has curated what promises to be an incredible day of learning and sharing. And I'd like, again, to join Dr. Kelly in thanking our partners in bringing this conference to you this year, South Carolina Lend, Prisma Health, and the Bradshaw Institute for Community Health and Advocacy. And I'd especially like to thank all those in curating today's conference, the 2021 Nurturing Developing Minds Conference and Research Symposium Planning Committee. And you can find a list of all the committee members in the conference program. However, I did want to give a special shout out to Dr. Dee Steglin, chair of the ICS Research Committee, and again, also to Megan Carolyn for all of her hard work in leading the logistical aspects of today's session. I'd also like to thank the amazing array of professionals who have agreed to join us today as presenters to share their experience and expertise with all of us. In closing, let me just state that there was a time early on, or as the pandemic pressed on last summer and into the fall, where we briefly considered not even offering Nurturing Developing Minds this year, believing that it just might be better to skip a year and return in person in 2022. However, we made the decision to offer the program virtually, and I'm very glad that we did. We have over 400 education, medical, policy, academic, and other professionals joining us for today's virtual conference. You know, in past conferences, we focused a lot on the importance of developing resilience in early childhood, and this past year has certainly highlighted the importance of being very resilient in the face of adversity. So I'd like to thank you all for your resilience and your tenacity in continuing to do the good work that you do for the benefit of children and families. So thank you all again. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Kelly, who will introduce this morning's keynote speaker.
Thank you, Jamie, and we're in for a treat. Dr. Perri Klass is our keynote speaker. She is a pediatrician and professor of journalism and pediatrics at New York University, as well as National Medical Director of Reach Out and Read, a national childhood literacy program that works through pediatric primary care to encourage reading with young children. The impact of this program is just immeasurable. She is also author of several books, both fiction and nonfiction, including the recent nonfiction, A Good Time to Be Born, How Science and Public Health Gave Children a Future, which describes how our world has been transformed by the radical decline of infant and child mortality. And my favorite, she is the co-author with Dr. Eileen Costello of Quirky Kids, Understanding and Supporting Your Child with Developmental Differences, which has just been published in a fully revised new edition by the American Academy of Pediatrics. This book is full of helpful information for parents of children who are wired to see the world a little differently. So without further ado or too much impinging on time, I am very honored and thrilled to introduce Dr. Klass to instruct us about body and mind, children's well-being in the pandemic. Dr. Klass.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that incredibly gracious introduction and for holding up our new book. And it's a great honor and a great pleasure to be here with you all. I'm going to share my screen now and bring up my slides. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit, starting with my role. I'm a pediatrician, but I'm also a journalist. I teach journalism at New York University, and I write about children's health and children's issues pretty much every week. And one of the things that's become clear during this pandemic, I heard journalist Ed Young, who's covered the pandemic for The Atlantic and has done some of the most important fundamental writing about what's been happening to all of us. And he talked about being a journalist. He talked about it as what he called an omni story, the pandemic. In other words, whatever you cover, whether you cover politics, whether you cover science, whether you cover economics, whether you cover the arts, there's a story that's a pandemic story. It goes into every corner, every beat, as we would call it in journalism. And what I've realized as somebody who writes about children is that it also goes into kind of every angle that we think about when we think about children and parents. There's not just one children in COVID story or parents and children. There aren't just two. Everything that I might write about, how children eat, how children exercise, how children grow, how children develop, children's mental health, children's sleep, parent-child relationships, education, it all gets reflected by what the parents and children everywhere have been living through this year. So I thought I would take you through some of the stories that I've written, because I'm the opposite of an expert. What I get to do for this column, which is a great joy and a great honor, is I get to think of questions which bother me, bother my colleagues, bother patients, and then I get to call up the people who really know and get them to explain it to me. So I thought I would pass on some of the questions that I've found myself asking and some of the answers I've gotten, and then move from that to some of the questions that probably we're all thinking about how we can support children, how we can do what we heard about in those wonderful introductions toward supporting the optimal healthy development of children, and especially supporting parents as they do this. So I'm just trying to advance my own slides. Give me a moment. And let me, yes. Okay, so one of the questions, here are some of the questions that I'm going to touch on, and I'm going to go through them quickly, but these were all pandemic columns. The question of development and what children have been missing and how that will affect them as they grow. The question of children's sleep, the question of eating and pandemic weight gain, the issues of children with special needs and what's happening to them, mental health issues ranging from anxiety, general mental health, suicidality, especially in adolescents and young adults, but also in younger teenagers. And then I want to at the end come back to the question, a question that I asked a lot of people as the pandemic wore on. How are we telling the story with our children, depending on who our children are and what they're living through? How are we together shaping their understanding, the memories that they're building, the story of what's happened to all of us this past year? And then I'm going to finish with the question of what can't wait, what can't be put on hold from a pediatric point of view. And that's going to bring me back to the question of stories. It's all going to be about stories, reach out and read, and supporting parents, which is what we all want to do. So I asked you, are the kids all right? And we know that's a complicated question, but we also know that children don't ever walk into any of the places where any of us work alone. How about the parents? And I think that the main lesson, which I know that other people here understand, is that parents are terribly worried. They're worried about pretty much every aspect of children's health and well-being right now. And they're also at the same time under pressures which affect every aspect of their own health and well-being. And that list I just showed you of how are children sleeping, how are children eating, how's their mental health, we could ask those same questions about parents. We could ask them about ourselves. It's not just an omni story in terms of children's health and well-being. It's an omni story that touches every aspect of adult life and family life. And we also know that parents find that the guidance that they're receiving, the guidance that all of us are receiving, evolves and in some cases shifts, and that many people are, for various reasons, at a distance from many of their usual sources of support, from the childcare provider who they used to see every day, from the teacher who used to spend time with the child, from friends, from family, and that people feel very isolated, very confused, very worried. And what I think I want to emphasize as I go through some of these topics is that a lot of the guidance we give as pediatricians, as professionals, a lot of the guidance, although it's good guidance, ups the ante for parents. That a lot of the advice we give puts even more pressure on parents who are already under pressure. And therefore, as we think about how we can support parents, we should also remember that some of the responsibility comes back to the very good but still difficult advice that we're giving to people who are already coping and managing heroically in an unprecedented situation. So I was going to start with this question of what's happening to children's development, especially young children. And one of the things that I've learned this year is for several times I've written about different issues involved with masks, but in some ways, the one that seemed to touch the most emotional nerve was the concern on the part of many parents that young children who are spending this past year in a setting in which so many people are masked are somehow going to miss out on some essential part of communication. And the column that I wrote about this, which had the headline, which some people found all by itself difficult, inflammatory, problematic, the writer never writes the headline. I'll just mention that. But here the headline was, "Do Masks Impede Children's Development?" And again, the great fun of doing this is that I get to talk to the people who've done the research, who have actually studied the issue of the role that facial expressions play as young children learn to understand communication, learn to read people's emotions. It actually has been studied, and I wanted to pass on some of their ideas. The idea that, yes, indeed, children do pick up visual cues, and they will be able to do that when they're at home with people who are not masked. But there's also an opportunity if children are spending a setting in which they are around people who are masked to be more creative, to help children take full advantage of the information that they do get, that parents and teachers can make more elaborate gestures, that they can make a game of how to communicate with hands and bodies. And in fact, and this is something which comes up again and again, that children, many children, may actually be able to develop additional skills. I spoke to a developmental psychologist in Hong Kong who has actually studied this, and I put over on the side some of the cards that she uses in which she covers a piece of the face and then asks her subjects, whether they're children or adults, to read the emotion. And what she has found is that children are actually very good at reading facial emotions, even when you show them pictures with masks. And what she said to me was we should give more credit to our own children, that voices and gestures and overall body language are all important for children, and that though they certainly do pay attention to people's mouths when people are talking, it's by far not the only cue that they have to communicate and to learn. And I just thought you might enjoy seeing how you study this in young children. So I gave you some of her sample experimental templates. And then another psychologist who suggested that this is an opportunity to be more explicitly verbal, to state your emotions clearly, to actually ask more often how children are feeling, and to get some of the emotional content of what goes on in a setting in which adults may be masked or children may be masked, to actually script it more for children so that it's discussed. And I wanted to give you the words of one of the experts. Children are very, very smart. They can figure out who a person is by using information still available to them. The shape of the eyes, the eyebrows, voice, and posture. And he suggested that, say, a teacher might want to be consistent about eyeglasses or to personalize masks to give them more cues, to slow down speech, to recognize that children may face some additional challenges, but that their resilience and their adaptability, if we give them the chance to develop additional skills, will carry them through. I just wanted to say, and this is the only example where I'm going to do this, is that when you post these columns online, people write in and comment, and the people who write in and comment are often very angry at you as the writer, whatever it is you've said. And anytime that you write anything about masks, and as I say, this seemed to me a very valid question that parents might have, and there really is research out there to address it, but people write in to say, this is a very small problem compared to a grandmother dying, remove this article, or else they write in to say, yes, you've clearly said that masks are very damaging, but we don't want to cut our paranoid position on COVID. So I just want to sort of explain that people have very strong emotional feelings, and I'm not, sometimes as the writer, you wonder whether what you're writing actually moves some of the people who have such strong feelings, but it gives you a little bit of an insight into what parents may be navigating in their own families and in their own communities. On the other hand, many of the people who write in comments, I should say, have really good suggestions, and I do read them and I learn a lot. Hear from a speech language pathologist, hear from someone who has two daughters, a friend with two daughters with hearing loss, and also from someone just saying this can be mentally and physically exhausting for students and teachers alike. And I appreciate the dialogue, and I appreciate what I learn always from people who are coming in with different skill sets than my own. I wanted to move on to sleep, which has been a very, very big concern for a lot of parents during the pandemic. Once again, interestingly, there's some early research which came out of China during the early and very, very severe lockdown in the pandemic there, in which they looked at more than 1,000 children in Guizhou, China, who were 4, 5, and 6, who were home during a very strict lockdown with their parents, and compared the sleep patterns of the children during the pandemic to sleep patterns of children the same age 2 years earlier, and found that the children were going to sleep later than the bedtimes in 2018. They were waking up earlier, and they weren't varying from weekdays to weekends. They were basically on a constant holiday schedule. Interestingly, they were sleeping longer at night than the children in the pre-lockdown period and less during the day. And maybe even most interestingly, I don't know if you can see this, the children in the pandemic actually had lower rates of reported sleep problems than the children in the pre-pandemic period. And the researchers considered this somewhat unexpected, fewer sleep disturbances. And one of the sleep specialists who had been a co-author said that she had been struck by the ways that many parents have been able to be more involved than usual with their children, and that this being home together had actually gone some way to addressing fears, even in an anxious time. And what she said resonated with me. It's not just what you do at night that helps with your circadian rhythms. It's having regular meal times, having things you do at a certain time during the day every day. And again, this is a message which has come up again and again in writing for parents, taking care of children, thinking about parents, is building those routines and finding ways to support and reassure children in the small but routine issues of daily life. By the time I wrote about food and pandemic weight gain, which was fairly recent, pretty much everybody in this story was worried about how we were making parents feel bad. There had been a lot of headlines. I put a couple up on the slide about children and weight gain. Here you see it described as an epidemic during a pandemic. So not only are you living through the viral pandemic, but if your child is not eating right and is gaining weight, there's a second epidemic right there in your home. And you can see that the headline on this column ended up being that experts advise families to avoid blaming themselves and to look for opportunities to congratulate children for healthy behaviors and good decisions. And I think by this time, and this was just a couple of months ago, there's real awareness on the part of experts that parents are being asked to do the impossible and that they're feeling like they're being blamed. And Dr. Perrin said parents should allow themselves some grace. Families are having a tough time. Kids are having a tough time. There's increased food insecurity. People have lost their jobs. Kids may have lost school meals. And that the suggestions that they wanted to make were actually, the group at Duke started with a category they called survival. And before they ever got to food, they wanted to talk about mind, heart, body, and spirit, avoiding blaming themselves, looking for those opportunities to congratulate children for healthy behaviors and good decisions. And another one of the diet and obesity experts said, it's important for people to have self-compassion. Maybe we should be helping people pick one thing they think they could change to make it healthier, strategize about how they might make progress on one thing, and forget what needs to get done for physical activity goals and perfect meal goals, do their best to eat at home, show up every day in terms of physical activity. And the suggestions were really to focus on behaviors, not weights, to take it one thing at a time, and above all, to not blame parents or children who are getting through such a hard time together. You saw that I'm interested in children who are developmentally different and have co-authored a book about them. And one of the groups that I've worried about a lot, and I know my colleagues have, and I know there are people here who serve this group in many different ways, is in fact children with special needs. And for many families, as you know, these are in some cases families who've spent years figuring out what the right program is for a child, finding the right placement, the right school, the right supports, and it all got disrupted. And many of these are children who, as you know, thrive on routine. They thrive on routine for learning, they thrive on routine for social interactions. And here we are asking parents to establish all of that at home and to supervise the learning, and in some cases to actually provide some of the supports and therapies that children might have been able to get in the classroom. And so again, the advice we're giving is good. It's the right advice to build structure and consistency in as much as possible, because these are children who really do better with set times for sleep and meals. But it's a lot to ask of parents. And my co-author, Eileen Costello, said this is exposing all the cracks, all the stress of raising a child with a disability. Many of these kids also have anxiety issues, and I wanted to note that there's a lot of interest right now in anxiety issues, including in younger children. And younger children, of course, are, as I think one of the doctors I quoted said, young children are not going to say, Mom, Dad, I'm feeling anxious, and this is how I'm manifesting that anxiety. Even older children may not say that, but especially younger children won't. They may be more clingy, but they may be more aggressive. So the anxious child may be the frightened, clingy, hesitant child, but it may be the tantrum throwing child and the defiant child and the oppositional child. And again, what we're sort of suggesting here for parents is be involved. There were specific suggestions about not having the anxiety conversations late at night and even picking a worry time or making a worry box to write down a worry, but not having it be the go to bed conversation, about reminding kids about their power and their agency, but also about being honest with children that this is a hard and complicated time, but that as a family, we're going to be able to cope with this and be okay. And then as I just a couple of weeks ago was looking at some of the data from a couple of children's hospital systems in this country, which have been doing suicide screening on all the children 10 or 11 and up coming in, and have noted an uptick in children who are describing suicidal thoughts or suicide attempts in the recent past. Again, when we ask advice, what can parents do? Parents who are concerned about a teenager's mental health, about a child who may be feeling despairing. Again, what the message is to check in, the message is to be there, the message is to ask, checking in. And I thought the advice was very good that came from the people I talked to. Not about trying to solve the child's problems, it's about listening. One of the pieces of advice from a group of adolescent advisors at Colorado Children's was, don't assume that your kids are struggling, but ask questions like, what's taking up your headspace? What are you grateful for? Or ask teenagers, how is this time affecting you? And be clear that it's a hard time and that the challenges are there, but they're not insurmountable. One of the psychologists I talked to said this to me, and it really, I put it in the article and then I wrote it down on an index card and put it in my desk. She had said suicidality is partly not being able to see the future. If we can change that, we can see remarkable changes. But she went on to say that she believed that the challenges of the pandemic could strengthen today's young people. And she said, I think we are going to have a generation of really remarkably resilient kids and teens who grow up to be really remarkable human beings as adults. And I thought back to the experts who talked to me about how children who are learning to read facial expressions and recognize people around masks will, some of them grow up to be especially sensitive, especially able to recognize emotion, especially empathic. And I think that recognizing both the resilience, the plasticity of children and their ability, if we help them, if we support them, to grow out of adverse circumstances with additional skills is something that I try to remember as I do this work. So when I wrote about what pediatricians say can't wait, of course, I wrote about the importance of keeping up on your immunizations and the importance of making up missed visits. And I talked about the American Academy of Pediatrics campaigns to reassure parents that there were a lot of precautions to make sure that it was safe to visit the doctor, and the Call Your Pediatrician campaign to try to get parents in. But one of the things that I wanted to say really can't wait is to think about how we're telling the story, how we're helping children tell the story, how we're helping parents help children tell this story. And here were some of the ideas that came up when I started talking about this with colleagues. People talking about, well, the concrete thinking of a 3.5-year-old whose mother said, we can't go because there's a virus that's making people sick, so we can't go, we don't want to get sick. And then the 3.5-year-old said, okay, that's fine. And 3 days later, he said, well, we didn't get sick, so can we go now? So I think that developmentally, thinking about where the child is developmentally, answering the questions, but also helping to shape it into a larger narrative and a larger memory of what happened to the child, the family, the community, the country, the world. If you ever have kids, someday you're going to tell them. This is a parent saying to a child. If you ever have kids, someday you're going to tell them about this time when we all stayed inside for months and everybody wore masks. And on the other hand, that's hard. One of the doctors I talked to said, this is asking a lot of parents. I think meaning making usually involves achieving a sense of central coherence. And a lot of parents don't have that right now. Parents referenced other narratives that had meant something to their children. Girl who was reading The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank and thinking about staying inside for a long time. A couple of parents who said Hamilton had mattered a lot. One child who had quoted it, "Mom, this is what it's like when the world turns upside down." And a number of parents who talked about children who were writing things down, who were keeping a journal. I'm telling my kids how incredible it is that everyone in the world is experiencing the same stress and worries at the same time. And even though we're physically distanced, we feel closer to one another due to this shared experience. And another parent whose daughter had been making a video journal saying, "I hope in 20 years I can show that to my kids to help them understand what the year 2020 was like." And then finally, my colleague, Dr. Ken Haller in St. Louis, who had a 6-year-old. He'd asked him what it's been like not to be in school. And the kid said, "I hate it." And his mother responded, he used to always say he hated school. And the child looked at his mother and said, "No, I didn't." And she returned his look with a raised eyebrow. And he said, "I miss my friends. I want to go back." So Dr. Haller asked the child, 20 years from now, you may have a kid of your own. What are you going to tell him about what it was like to be around in 2020? And the boy answered, "I'll tell him it was real bad, and I'll tell him that I really liked school." And the mother smiled, and she said, "I'll tell him we were just tired all the time, but somehow we all got through it." So having brought this around to the question of telling stories and narratives, I want to go back now to the question of early childhood and supporting parents and the work that I've done with Reach Out and Read, because I think it connects. I think it's about the centrality of the parent's voice. It's about organizing the world a little bit into stories. It's about the pleasure that you take when the two of you together can concentrate on understanding a story, on the back and forth and the relationship aspect that you build when you look at a book together, when you tell each other a story, when you have that kind of communication. And I think this is so important because it's really about building on the strengths of parents and caregivers. It's about saying to them and meaning it, your voice, your ability to point things out in the world, to name the world, to build that into a story, that is central. That is what your child wants, and that is something that you can do even in difficult times. I think that when we start working with parents of very young children, and this has been the principle with Reach Out and Read, that what we're doing with the books is really about building those foundational early relationships which build the brain circuits. And so the message for parents, of course, is that from the time a baby is very young, the books and the reading aloud help a child enjoy time with you and practice language and learn about the world and help you establish the routines and structures, coming back to that constant refrain of routines and structures and what we're asking of parents, even during stressful times like these, and that those relationships and routines are what build resiliency. They're what help that child handle challenges and stress, and that one of the reasons we love doing this with books and stories and language and communication is that that also helps a child get ready to learn and ready to read in school. And the messages for clinicians are really very similar. We all know that we want to support those strong positive relationships between children and caregivers to promote healthy development. We know that there are disparities in development and that school readiness is a place where we see those disparities and that inequities can be exacerbated as children grow, and that if we're thinking about children growing up in difficult circumstances, we're thinking about children who are exposed to stress. It's by supporting those strong early relationships that we can buffer toxic stress, or that the parents and caregivers can buffer toxic stress for young children, even in difficult times. And what we're trying to do is find ways, all of us, to build strength-based support and guidance for parents and for caregivers, which can build those nurturing daily routines. So Reach Out and Read has been around for 32 years, and it's literacy development and school readiness, but it's also early childhood, early brain development. And more and more and more, we understand that to do all of that, early childhood, early brain development, we have to think in terms of those foundational early relationships, which are how children's brains develop and how they learn. I think many of you are probably familiar with the program. It's anticipatory guidance at checkups, starting at birth about reading aloud and building routines and how to enjoy books with infants and toddlers and preschoolers, and a beautiful developmentally and culturally appropriate new book at every checkup, starting in infancy until school age. And back when we could do this, which is not a pandemic possibility, we had volunteer readers in the waiting room, and you have amazing programs in South Carolina. Reach Out and Read Carolinas has done a phenomenal job, and all kinds of innovative programs and connections. And all of this everywhere is to incorporate the books into our pediatric care, encourage families to read aloud together, to give young children a foundation for success. And this is a wonderful thing to get to do in a pediatric office, but it's obviously not something which is restricted to a pediatric practice or a pediatric office. It's a strength-based strategy. The underlying message always and forever is that your child will love books because your child loves you. It's about being in your arms, being in your lap, hearing your voice. It's not, and you know, I sometimes have been known to say this in the exam room. He doesn't actually want me to read this book. He wants you to read this book. He doesn't want me to point out the pictures. She wants you to show her. And that's absolutely true with young children. And of course, the young children will inevitably chew on the books. That's a good thing. And so that's what we do from infancy through age 5. We talk with parents about looking at books with young children. We model, where's the baby? There's the baby. Where's the baby? We point, we name. We sort of try to show how you use the book in the interaction, how the book is something to evoke your voice, the back and forth, to cuddle up and build routines around books that you're, and this is what we're really saying is it's very important to spend positive, language-rich, interactive, contingent time with your child, but we don't have to say it that way. We can say it with the back and forth and the book. And we give the child that beautiful book to take home and keep. And when we do it right, we do it at the beginning of the visit, and we can see how the child handles the book and where the child is in terms of fine motor and developmental and language development. And we can see what the parent-child interaction is like. And we can enjoy the way the children respond to the books and the way the parents and caregivers respond to the children's responses. We can advise people if we like to do it as a kind of prescription. And we can watch the way that children react to the books that we have. We have an array of published evidence to show that if we do this, parents will report reading more often. This is a study in which parents reported reading 3 or more days a week. And so parents will report reading more often. And we can also see that if you look at language in the preschool years, that the receptive language, the language that children understood, was 6 months ahead in the children who were getting Reach Out and Read. And the expressive language, the words that they said, as opposed to the words they understood, I might have said that wrong. The receptive language, the words they understood, was 6 months ahead. The expressive language, the words they said, was 3 months ahead. And this was a high-risk urban sample of children. So again, we're seeing that we can have an effect on preschool language by encouraging these parent-child back and forth interactions around books. And I'm not going to take you through all of the other studies, but parents are more likely to read to their children, more likely to say, if you ask them what they most enjoy doing with their children, to mention reading and books. Children's language ability, I just showed you, improved, and parents are more likely to report reading more often. So we're a national program, although, as I said, you've got a phenomenal regional organization in the Carolinas. We serve 4.5 million children each year through more than 33,000 people, medical providers, doctors, nurse practitioners, pediatricians, family physicians, PAs who have done the training. And we're giving out about 7.2 million books every year with that advice at more than 6,000 program sites. We're reaching at this point probably 1 of every 4 children growing up in poverty, which is, you could say that's a wonderful thing because we're reaching 1 out of every 4. You could say that's a bad thing because there are 3 out of 4 we should still be reaching, or you could just say that's a terrible thing that there are so many children growing up in poverty. But our goal is to reach all of those children, and in fact, all children and all parents. We're working on it. In 2014, my professional organization, the American Academy of Pediatrics, declared that literacy promotion was an essential component of primary care practice and recommended that it should be part of primary care in pediatrics, beginning in infancy and continuing at least until the age of school entry, reviewing this evidence that I just showed you, that the intervention is associated with more positive attitudes, more frequent reading aloud, improved interactions, improvements in the home literacy environment, and language improvements. And so it has gradually, over the last 30 years, become more and more of a standard within primary care. And having the American Academy of Pediatrics back it was tremendously important. And we're working now on the revision of this policy statement and on expanding it. The reason that the books matter, I just want to come back to everything they do. When you give the parent or caregiver of a young child a book, you are recommending lap time, face time, physical contact, even in stressed families. When you talk about reading at transition times, reading at bedtimes, you're talking about building routines and trying to give children a sense of security and predictability. But you're also expressing your faith in the parent. And we have some evidence that these routines and the reading promote a parent's sense of self-efficacy, and they may work against parental depression. It's also a way of trying to replace some of the screen time that's such a constant in children's lives without saying less screen time, which is something we also say. We're trying to build those loving and supportive family relationships. Language-rich interactions, which will help children develop the early language skills that they need to express their needs and emotions and get their needs met. And also, we know that preschool language predicts school readiness and reading and math success. So we're trying to establish routines from the beginning. We've been thinking a lot about how to do this in the newborn period and how to choose books for very small babies. We've been thinking about bedtime routines and transition routines. We've been trying to make this as practical and helpful as we can for stressed parents. We know, I want to say a word about positive interactions with parents and caregivers. And I think you're going to hear much more about this later today and from people who know much more than I do. But we know that that early childhood experiences change the way that genes work, that they affect the way a child's brain forms and functions, that they affect resilience to toxic stress, that they affect cognitive and social emotional development, that they affect health and well-being into adulthood. So when we talk about those all-important foundational early relationships, we're talking about all of those pathways. And we know we've all heard a lot and thought a lot and worried a lot about adverse childhood experiences in recent years. And I think the emerging evidence that you can also look at positive childhood experiences, and that those positive childhood experiences can mitigate some of the effects of adverse childhood experiences, has given all of us a better way to understand what we might be able to do by supporting parents. And you're looking at a graph of how children are doing with no adverse experiences over on the far left, over to 1 to 2 to 3 to multiple. And when you study whether children who have experienced adverse childhood experiences can still flourish, and the Child Flourishing Index looks to see whether children are curious, whether they're able to complete tasks, and whether they're in control when they're faced with a challenge. What you find is that the likelihood that children will be flourishing, even in spite of those adverse experiences, they are more likely to flourish if they have the positive childhood experiences, which for my purpose includes on the list the being read to. And it gives us a way to understand what we're trying to do here on another level. We're trying to promote a positive parenting practice. And here's a list of the positive parenting practices which seem to be able to mitigate those early adverse experiences: reading a book together, storytelling and singing, playing with a peer, family outing, family meal, lowering the TV watching. And I think part of what we're offering parents with the books and the encouragement is a script, a routine for something that recurs as a positive parenting activity and a positive childhood experience. From the point of view of Reach Out and Read, then, our model is that these positive childhood experiences can define the trajectory of a young child's life, that we have access in pediatric primary care to children in the critical early years. But I know I'm talking to many people who have other kinds of access and other moments, and may have more time with parents, or more concentrated time with parents, or may see them more often. So I don't mean to suggest this as an intervention which can only happen in primary care. I just mean that we have to take advantage of our primary care access in order to do this, to promote positive, essential back and forth interactions and build those relationships and support and encourage parents so that we can do this. I started talking about this by talking about books and brains. Parents can be engaged, caregivers can be engaged from infancy on. We hope they'll feel empowered. We hope the environment will be more stimulating with the books and the pictures and the increased language exposure. We hope that books will be built into daily routines and bedtimes. We hope that children will find their way to the library, and parents and caregivers will find other programs and resources, and that children will arrive at school with basic early literacy skills and a love of books, and of course, that everyone will love going to the doctor. We're doing it right from birth. This is just a tiny piece of our training, talking about what you might say to a parent of a newborn, that babies are listening and looking and learning right from birth, that you can talk and read and sing and play together, that the baby needs to see your face, that you build these moments in, and then again and again the message that your newborn baby knows and loves your voice. And then moving on to the 4-year-old getting ready to go to school. By then, I've skipped over a lot, obviously. You have a child who might be recognizing numbers and letters and learning the names and the sounds that letters make, and retelling familiar stories and making rhymes and following longer and more complicated stories. So then, by then you're giving guidance about letting the child choose the book, asking the child to tell the story from the pictures, pointing out the letters in the child's name, connecting the story to the child's experiences, being able to talk about feelings and emotions. Another quality that comes up in some of these studies of positive childhood experiences as good predictors. And of course, finding books about the things that your child is interested in, because one of the messages something, whatever it is, there's a book out there that can tell you about it. I was gonna close with I collect these images of reading Madonnas from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance in Europe, because these are some of the only images we have from those periods of children. And I think it's interesting, here you see Madonna and Child, in which you see the child actually handling the pages of the book. And you can see that the painter is interested in how a child grips and turns pages. I'm going to finish by saying, how do books build better brains? There's the high quality language rich interaction. There's the serve and return. There's the FaceTime and the lap time. There's the routine and the ritual, the decreased parent stress and increased self-efficacy. There's the exposure to all the parts of early literacy, print and letters and story structure and sequence. And then there's those positive associations with books and stories, coming to know books and stories in the lap of someone you love, through the voice of someone you love. And you take that with you into school and beyond. When you think about it, learning to read in school is a remarkable thing. Children have remarkable brains. To learn to read, you have to marshal your vision, your cognition, your memory, your phonological awareness. The B makes a bus sound, your phonemic awareness. The BA makes a bass sound, your vocabulary, your sense of sequence, your understanding of story, all through motivation. It's an amazing thing that children can do it. And I would add to that, that reading aloud to a child can be a triumph of the spirit, because children's brains are supported and nurtured during these vital developmental windows that we started talking about, masking and language and how they learn. We know there are vital developmental windows. We have to find ways to support and nurture the brain, that families can maintain routines that create security and build resilience, that children are learning words and numbers and concepts, rhymes, stories, all of this in the context of attention and affection. And also they're learning that books are sources of pleasure and information, and that when their parents open those books and read with them, their parents can help open up the world. And so this is one more of my reading Madonnas. This is Botticelli. And I think what's interesting about these paintings is that the painters, I can't explain the religious iconography, but it's clear that these are painters who felt there was something sacred about this scene. And in this particular painting, Botticelli is also very, very interested in the question of the way a baby might look to his mother, the way a mother might look at her baby, and at the interaction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Klass. We really appreciate the remarks that you have shared with us this morning. We are going to work through a few of the questions that folks have shared in the chat box. Please do feel free to keep those coming, folks, and we'll try to get through sort of as many as we can, or sort of broad-ranging questions here. I want to start by saying one of our attendees said, not a question, but a comment. Dr. Klass is singing my song, and I think that that's how many of us feel today after this session. You know, I myself am a researcher with the Institute for Child Success, and my son is doing virtual preschool in the next room. And so I think for many of us wearing multiple hats who are in this conversation today, we're very grateful for your approach to translating research into, you know, action for our lives. So one question that we had that came in pursuant to some of the journalism experiences you've shared is you referenced the strong and differing responses to your articles regarding the challenges of the pandemic. Do you have any advice for parents and caregivers in explaining to children how the adults around them can have such different opinions about what is best for them, and sort of navigating some of those conflicting signs that children might be getting?
What an interesting question. I think that's a really important part of what's going on. That is to say, it's been a complicated year. It's a complicated situation. There is a lot of disagreement, and I think it's got a bunch of pieces to it. One of the exciting things about narrating this year, because I think for many of us it's been one of the interesting things about living through it, is this is a chance to show a child how science works. That is to say, instead of presenting science to a child as this is what we know, these are the facts, you must memorize it, here you have a chance to say, here are a lot of very smart people trying to figure something out. And sometimes they learn that what they thought was true is not true, and that's how science works. And then they stand up and say, actually, we have new information. And I think that for a child who's interested and a parent who's willing to take it on, that's actually a fascinating story. But of course, there's also more to it than that, because there are people, as I showed you in the comments, with very different ideas. And I think this is a situation where you really, as parents and maybe as a country, we all need to think carefully about how we are going to tell the story of people who we disagree with and who disagree with us. And it's a challenge in parenting always. And I think it's something that challenges us to to try to be our better selves, to try to say, well, I don't agree with, your aunt. And so here's how we're going to try to stay in touch with her, even though we rules. I think that's an ongoing challenge, and that's not just around the issues of the pandemic.
Absolutely agree. Another question that we have in here is whether you could speak a bit to the challenges, particularly of families with single parents or families who are juggling multiple jobs at one time, and not that we're looking to you to solve all of our problems in the next 10 minutes, but the question ends with, what do you think would be the most effective for those families?
So first thing I should have said this first, and we should probably all be saying this first. Parents are doing an unbelievable job. I mean, we should be, I should be starting by saluting. I should be starting by acknowledging that even the parents who are coming for help, asking for help, are already doing more than anybody should have to do. Even the parents who have it, quote unquote, relatively easy, don't have it easy. But for the parents who are struggling economically, for the parents who are doing this alone, for the parents who must, who are put in impossible situations in terms of what they need to do in order to work, what they need to do in order to support their families, what they need to do in order to supervise their children. I think probably like most of the people here, I think there are fixes which should go well beyond individual fixes. I think that, I'm a pediatrician. I think that our first priority as a country should be the safety and well-being of our children and figuring out how their places can be as safe as possible and supporting their families. So on the one hand, I understand the, parent you up with how can we help you. That's the responsibility of anybody who does any kind of clinical work. And by clinical work, I don't just mean medical clinical work. I mean anyone who's coming into contact with one family after another. But I also think that there is so much stress and so much distress that a lot of this has to also come from structures and supports that we build from either the community or the state or the country, because I think it's too big a problem to solve parent by parent.
Absolutely. We have a few questions in the chat that are related specifically to reading and literacy development. Someone asked, what's the most important thing that we can share with preschool teachers about reading development in children? We have another question about specific resources for finding books about special needs, families and children with special needs. And so noting that we only have 5 minutes left, I guess for folks who are in this conversation today who sort of feel really motivated by what you've shared about the brain science and reading, what should be their next step? Any resources that you would share or sort of practical elements they can start incorporating?
So, I'm going to start by saying you have Reach Out and Read Carolinas, which has a lot of resources, including local resources and information and programs. I think I saw a question go by about book lists. A lot of really good work has been done developing book lists to use with children with special needs, book lists that you can use to address all different kinds of complicated issues that you might want to talk about with children, book lists that are as inclusive as we can make them. And through both Reach Out and Read and the American Academy of Pediatrics, but there are also resources available from the American Library Association. There are a lot of people out there who care passionately children's books and children's literature, and making sure that there are good and diverse and appealing books out there for families. In terms of the question for preschool teachers, I wrote a column just last week about my 4th grade teacher who read to us every day, who was the most amazing teacher I ever had. And she did something that you probably wouldn't be allowed to do in a classroom nowadays. I was in 4th grade a while ago. She lit a reading candle, and she would read to us by the light of the reading candle, and then we would all blow it out together. And she would say, "There go your wishes up in the smoke. May they all come true." And I wrote about the power that having a teacher who read to us every day, it didn't have a particular didactic purpose. She read us books because she thought we'd love them. And I think what I wanted to say about that was I showed you the comments, and sometimes the comments are angry and sometimes the comments are dismissive. This time when I wrote about my wonderful 4th grade teacher, 100 people wrote in to remember the teachers who read to them. Remember the voice of the teacher who read to them every day as a break in the school day, as a ritual. So I would encourage teachers to make a ritual of it. And I would say, decades later, children will still remember the stories that you introduced them to, and the sound of your voice, and the ritual in the school day.
I felt very fond memories coming back to me as you shared that story as well. Wonderful. So I think that we are right about at our 10:40 mark. Dr. Klass, I just want to thank you once again for giving of your time and energy with us today. I think you are singing the song for many of us, and we're delighted to get to start our day with you today. I think too, we're going to be preparing organizationally some follow-up emails for everybody after the session, so we'll be able to share some of the resources that Dr. Klass mentioned in case you weren't furiously taking notes as we went, and we'll reach out about sharing some of your slides as a PDF as well. Moving forward with our day, I want to remind folks that you should have received an email from individual Zoom accounts to log in directly to the sessions that you're participating in. If you did not, you should also have an email this morning from the Institute for Child Success mailing list. It kind of looks like a mailing list email that has the login information for all of the sessions. If you can just go to zoom.us and you can start your session from there. We appreciate everyone's flexibility with the technology as we get used to things. This is my little 4-year-old who wanted to come by and see what was so interesting this morning. And Dr. Klass, just can't thank you enough for all of the insights you have shared with us today and the work that you continue to do for children every day. Okay, take care, everybody. We will see you in your next sessions. Please reach out to mcarolyn at instituteforchildsuccess.org if you have any questions around the professional development process or any challenges.